Hi, I'm Izzy Conn and welcome to Leading Labour and this episode on Neil Kinnock. For the last year, I've been interviewing senior insiders and experts to understand the stories of each former Labour leader since 1945. The episodes look at how each leader responded to major national and international developments, managed the ever-present tension between the left and right of the Labour Party, and overall, how they sought to win elections and bring Labour into government. This episode is really special, as you will have heard in other episodes, I interviewed Neil Kinnock himself, so we'll be able to hear his own recollections on his leadership. Kinnock became leader after Michael Foot resigned following the defeat of 1983. Foot had mostly kept Labour together, but the party was still incredibly divided, and Kinnock took over only 4 years into what would be 18 years in opposition. So there was a long road ahead. He's remembered for modernising and detoxifying the party, despite losing the 2 elections he fought. Let's hear first from Martin Westlake, Kinnock's biographer, currently a visiting professor in practice at the LSE European Institute.
His key strengths were courage. He is a courageous gentleman, still is. Fortitude, didn't give up. Energy, stamina, vision, passion, commitment, charisma. Without that, he would have been finished.
Kinnock was born on the 28th of March 1942 into a working-class family in Tredegar in Wales. Let's start by hearing from Neil himself about how his early life and community impacted his politics.
Where I was brought up and the people I was brought up by had a lot to do with it. Not because they were stridently political. My mother and father and my grandparents, uncles and aunts, neighbours, they knew where they stood. And if you asked them, are you socialists? They'd say yes. But very matter-of-factly. Do you belong to the union? Yeah, of course. I'm in work. What do you expect me to do? That would be that. It must have been about, maybe 11, 12, when I realized that all the good things in our area, in my life, had one big thing in common, and that was they were provided by the community. They were collectively provided, with people making small contributions that resulted in provision that my family could never have afforded in a million years, from a swimming pool to the workman's hall, the cinema, every damn thing. And it didn't arrive as a shaft of lightning. And if you'd asked me when I was 14, the same question, I couldn't have given you that answer. So it's on reflection that I know that made me conscious of combined, collective, cooperative, all the core words, opportunity and strength.
Kinnock looked up to Anar and Bevan, the leading left figure who established the NHS in the 1945 government, who was his local MP.
My member of parliament was Anar Bevan, who was in my pantheon of heroes, with John Charles and Bleddyn Williams and Gilbert Parkhouse, the Morgan and England opening batsman, and the boxers of my generation. Nearly all of my heroes were sporting heroes, naturally, but alongside them, there was Nye. I heard him first when I was about 10, in about 1952, in the wake of the defeat of the Labour government, obviously in 51. And then I distinctly remember hearing him and seeing him in action in 1956 in the great protests against Suez, law not war. And that was magical. And then I knew I understood.
He was inspired to get into Labour politics.
Not only is collective contribution and provision the way to fulfillment and freedom, but in order to do anything about it, and it needed to be done, just as surely as playing sport had to be done, or going out with girls had to be done, or learning 3 guitar chords had to be done, you had to get organized. And with Bevan as an inspiration, there was only one organisation ever for me, and that was the Labour Party.
After attending Cardiff University and being involved in student politics there, Kinnock was elected in 1970, aged 28, as the MP for Bedwellty. It's interesting that he was the first of the Labour leaders in this series, apart from Attlee, not to have been first elected in the 1945 election. If Labour's problem during the latter Wilson and Callaghan years and underfoot was that they looked out of step with modern society, then Kinnock was a sign that Labour was modernising, even just in his age. He started his political career stridently on the left, supporting unilateral nuclear disarmament and leaving the EEC. I interviewed Charles Clarke, who worked really closely with Kinnock for 11 years, first as his researcher and then as Chief of Staff, and would go on to be Home Secretary in Tony Blair's government.
He was appointed the Shadow Education Secretary by Jim Callaghan when he was still leader of the party, and Neil was very positive about the challenges involved there.
Kinnock was really close to Foot, and he remained Shadow Secretary of State for Education throughout Foot's leadership. Then, seeing the direction that the party was going in, he began to consider leadership himself.
By the time we got to 1983 and certain defeat at a general election, I knew, because I was sufficiently honest with myself, and my closest comrades told me in any case that I was going to have to run for the leadership. By closest comrades, I mean literally one or two in Parliament, and my wife, who said it without any form of ambition. She said it with great, great regret, because we'd been close to Michael and Jill, his wife, and seen what utter purgatory it is. So I knew I had to run. And I knew if I did run, the only candidate that would cause me any real difficulty would be Tony Benn if he was still a Member of Parliament. As it happens, he was defeated in his Bristol constituency. So my opponent inevitably was Roy Hattersley. He was the natural candidate of the non-left, as it were.
Eric Heffer and Peter Shaw also ran. Kinnock won with 71.3%, and Roy Hattersley became his deputy. He inherited the policies of the 83 manifesto that had been called the longest suicide note in history.
I had to avoid making a bonfire of the 1983 manifesto because it was a compendium, a gigantic compendium of policy stances adopted over the previous 3 or 4 years on a gigantic scale. So I couldn't afford to simply set a match to all that. But what I had to make was I had to make my reservation clear.
The divisions over policy stances were incredibly deep-rooted.
Issues on which there was division had existed for a long time. Belief in those divisions had grown very deep, almost religious roots. And so if we were going to secure the change that I knew was vital to give democratic socialism a chance, then I was going to have to not just win arguments, but uproot beliefs.
So, what direction did Kinnock seek to take the party in, and what were his key challenges? Let's hear from Martin Westlake again.
So he had a really uphill battle to reassert the party's role as the main party of opposition. That really was a near miss. And then the second stage was to get the party into a position where it could aspire to win a general election again. Neil was always a pragmatist in the sense that he didn't see the point of ideological battles if there could not be government at the end of it. The important thing for him was to get into power to be able to help the people that the Labour Party stands for and stood for in those days.
So, with this very divided party, how did Kinnock appoint his shadow cabinet? Here's Charles Clarke.
The key issue was to go for competence. It was quite commonplace in politics for the leader of the party to choose people who were aligned to them politically on a kind of left-right basis. Neil said at all times, I'm going to try and make sure I go for the best possible people. And he did that. His hands were tied to a significant degree because the shadow cabinet leadership was elected by the Parliamentary Labour Party and not appointed by him. Once elected to the shadow cabinet, he could then appoint to the particular roles. But what he did was appoint key people to roles just outside the shadow cabinet, people like Brian Gould, Mo Molam, Robin Cook, Jack Straw, from which they could then get the status to be able to be elected to the leadership and then be taken forward. But his fundamental view was we've got to go for competence and got to go for high quality people. The more that people from outside see us as focused on our own concerns as a party rather than focused on the country's concerns, the more difficult it will be for us to gain the confidence of the country. So that's what he thought with each of the people in these particular fields.
The first national crisis came 3 months into his leadership, in the form of the miners' strike. In 1984, when about 3/4 of Britain's 187,000 miners went on strike against Margaret Thatcher's planned pit closures, this disrupted the modernising intentions that Kinnock was entering the leadership with. As we heard in previous episodes, the unions had played a huge role in the downfall of Edward Heath's Conservative government and James Callaghan's government in the 70s. Arthur Scargill was president of the NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers.
I'd known Scargill since the late 60s, when he was compensation officer, I think that was his title, of the Yorkshire NUM, ex-member of the Young Communist League, on the left, but politically a moron, because he entertained illusions that quite a lot of people have at 15 years of age. I mean, ideologues are often people who have only ever made up their minds once in their lives. And that's not the real world. You can't drive a car on that basis. You can't bring up kids on that basis. Certainly, there's not much you can do if you're not prepared to adapt.
I also spoke to historian David Kogan about Kinnock. He's author of the book Protest and Power, The Battle for the Labour Party.
Scargill and Kinnock disliked one another intensely. You know, they came from one from Yorkshire, one from Wales. Kinnock, suddenly only 3 or 4 months into his leadership, is faced with a strike by the NUM, and his whole family came from an NUM background. And he had to basically take a decision about where Labour was going to be positioned, given that Scargill had not called a national ballot.
Scargill's refusal to call a national ballot, which is a nationwide vote among union members to decide whether to strike, was hugely controversial. Instead, he relied on votes in individual coalfields, which meant not all miners were officially on strike. Many, including the Labour Party leadership, believed that this bypassed union democracy and made it easy for the government and media to portray the strike as illegitimate. Conservative historian Peter Dorey talks us through the Thatcher government's motive behind letting the strikes continue.
Back in 1974, the Conservative government of Edward Heath was brought down by the National Union of Mine Workers. And so the Conservative Party was always, ever since then, determined to crush the miners once and for all, to punish them and stop it happening again. So the victory over the miners, therefore, in 84-85 was basically crucial in establishing or reinforcing Thatcher's authority. But it also sent out to other trade unions, because it said to other unions, look, the miners were the strongest union in Britain. Even they have been crushed by us. So you civil servants or university lecturers, don't even think about it, because basically we've beaten the miners, we're going to beat you as well. It was damaging for Labour, because Kinnock, in a way, was on the back foot. Because every time, as it were, there's an outbreak of picket line violence, for example, or a clash with the police on the picket lines, the Tories would say to Neil Kinnock, do you condemn this mob rule? Do you condemn this violence? And he was torn because between, as it were, giving support to the miners and, as it were, yes, need to condemn the violence. So the Tories basically kind of pushed Labour into a box.
Here's Charles Clarke.
Neil had to lead through that situation. It wasn't easy. He came from a mining family. His constituency was a mining community. He had absolute sympathy with the position of the mine workers themselves, but at the same time knew that the decision not to have a ballot had made the NUM position almost indefensible. The consequence of this going on over a period of a year or two at the beginning of Neil's leadership was that he couldn't really address, as much as he would have wished to, the challenges of building a party that was able to take its case to the country at the 1987 election. And that was the case.
We lost somewhere between 18 and 24 months of time for change because the Labour Party, the Labour movement, naturally was totally distracted and diverted by the issues relating to the miners' strike. The issue of coal, the issue of the communities became the absolute preoccupation of everybody. The idea of us undertaking or completing the change processes in those circumstances was nonsensical. I mean, we ploughed on a bit with it, but not with anything like the energy or determination that was required.
His own particular relationship with the coalfield communities was a very, very important part of his makeup as a man. And so he felt very deeply the tensions that were involved in this situation, which made him, understandably really, very angry indeed.
On Scargill, Neil still believes that he took advantage of the miners.
I believe he abused the superhuman loyalty of the finest people in our country. So I'll never forgive him for that.
David Kogan thinks that this helped bolster Kinnock's image with the public.
I think in many ways, people saw Neil Kinnock very differently after 1984. I mean, in 1983, he gets elected as leader and he's a kind of, loquacious Welsh lefty who wasn't Tony Benn. He was seen as a man of courage because he'd opposed Benn, which was a very courageous thing to do, but not necessarily a heavyweight who was going to be able to really show the capacity to take difficult decisions. Actually, the miners' strike showed that Neil Kinnock was a man of unbelievable courage who took extraordinarily difficult decisions against his own movement and against quite a substantial part of the parliamentary party.
Now, let's look at the SDP, the centrist breakaway party. At first, they seemed like a huge issue at the outset of Kinnock's leadership. They'd nearly beaten Labour to being the second largest party in 83, gaining only 2.2% less of the vote than Labour, though this was not translated into seats. Let's hear from Martin Westlake.
The absolute imperative was to avoid further schism. Nobody else should leave for the SDP. That was the first thing. But the problem was the SDP was occupying the centre-left ground, whilst the radical Conservative governments were dragging that centre ground to the right. So Neil was aiming at a moving target.
But the SDP didn't turn out to be as much of a problem as they first seemed. Here's David Kogan.
Basing off Scargill by rebuilding the organs of the party, by uniting centre-left and centre-right, but also by giving the Labour Party a much more modern feel and approach, which was part of the cultural approach of the SDP. By the time you get people like Brian Gould and others coming through who Kinnock promoted, it looked like a young, thrusting, go-ahead party in the way that it hadn't done under Callaghan and Foote.
Thatcher had really come into her stride by 83. As we heard in Callaghan's episode, he had suggested in 1976 that what we might call the old Labour economic model wasn't working. But commitment to nationalisation was reinstated with vigour in Foote's 83 manifesto. Kinnock then renewed the move away from old Labour economic principles as a crucial part of his modernisation of the party. This was really criticised and often still is by the left. But as Neil says, to him it wasn't just a response to Thatcherism.
It was clear by the 1980s that the concepts of public ownership that had been settled upon by the post-war government were not fitting. But I always knew that. My father worked for the National Coal Board for a short time when he was a coal miner, and then he came out of the pits. He had industrial dermatitis, very severe industrial dermatitis. And then he worked for a nationalist steel industry, Richard Thomas and Baldwin's, in Ebbw Vale. And when I said to my dad, who was a very thoughtful man, about nationalisation, I never forget him saying to me, well, he said, it always struck me as the same bloody team in different jerseys. And of course, in the form of public ownership we had, Morrisonian public ownership, post-war, it was saving British capitalism. No doubt about that. And thank God it did. But the idea that it was applied industrial socialism or a transformation of ownership was just not sustainable. And my father's phrase fitted it. So I always knew that it really wasn't the epitome, the fulfillment of the socialist dream. Those changes were necessary regardless of privatization and the piracy of Thatcherism. We, myself and my colleagues, were trying to provide alternatives, not imitations and accommodations of Thatcherism.
Thatcher called an election for Thursday the 11th of June 1987, 4 years into the 5-year maximum term. But Kinnock hadn't made the progress that he needed, and commentators were fairly unanimous on the Conservatives winning. Policies were decided by Labour's National Executive Committee. Will, the editor of this podcast, and I spoke to Labour historian Christopher Massey, author of The Modernisation of the Labour Party 1979 to 97, about internal struggles that had prevented more policy change.
In the 1983 to 87 period, Kinnock spends the majority of his time trying to show that the party's not on the left, because Kinnock once himself was on the left, but also he spends an inordinate amount of time really establishing, I don't mean managerialist control, but control over the Labour Party's internal organs, particularly the National Executive Committee. So it takes him a battle of 3.5 years to get control of the executive. Because it takes him so long to get control, or to get support on the executive, to be kinder, it means that he can't institute the policy change necessary to pitch Labour in 1987 to a wider electorate.
But the 87 manifesto was much more moderate than 83. Left-wing policies of leaving the EEC, abolition of the House of Lords, and the breakup of NATO had gone. Let's hear from Neil on his view going into the election.
We hadn't even begun to change enough. We were still a unilateralist nuclear disarmament party. The punch-ups were still going on inside the Labour Party. People admired what I'd done with the ultra-left and the fact that I'd virtually eradicated Bennism and all that meant. But what they saw was a party preoccupied by itself. And people just don't vote for that. Consequently, I knew we were going to be defeated. I just hoped that it would be a defeat by less than turned out to be the case.
1987 is a less talked about election now, but it was important in campaigning terms, seeing the birth of modern media management and the rise of computers in election campaigning. Kinnock had modernised the Labour image, headed by Peter Mandelson as head of communications, who would obviously become a key player in New Labour, and is also the grandson of Herbert Morrison, Attlee's old foe for those that have listened to episode 1. In the 1987 election, Labour famously commissioned Hugh Hudson, the director of Oscar Best Picture winner Chariots of Fire, to make a party political broadcast. However, as Charles Clarke recalled, it was an existential battle.
The SDP Liberals were fighting against us, and they wanted to get second place in the overall ballot. And we were very concerned if that had happened, that would have really set us back a very long way. We didn't expect to win the election, but we did expect to make progress, and we did. Neil's leadership was a central factor in that.
Kinnock made Labour seem more moderate, and the campaign was slick. The left were given a backseat role, though the campaigns of the Conservative and SDP Liberal alliance painted them as always hiding in the wings. The result was a Conservative landslide majority of 102 seats, the third consecutive defeat for Labour. Labour's vote increased by 3.2%, only 2.2% ahead of the SDP Liberal alliance.
Because the mountain was high and steep, I always thought of my task as being, if I can use a cricket analogy, a 2-innings game. That we should try to score as well as we could in the first innings to give us a good chance of winning in the second innings. And it didn't work out like that.
At the first PLP meeting post-election, Kinnock said, "This is the most successful campaign in the history of the party. It has been recognised as such by our opponents and the pundits. But we failed to win the election, and there is no consolation for defeat in any form. Millions will suffer." He said that in the future, with every word, every action and every deed, we must support the idea of victory. Kinnock stayed on as leader.
I could have step down, and I certainly thought about it, not obsessively, but it did occur to me. The problem was I knew myself, and then I would talk to one or two people who I knew would be absolutely loyal, but absolutely honest, unrestrained in their honesty, no matter how much it hurt. And they offered the same conclusion that I did, that if I could stand down and there was somebody else who could do the job required, go. But there was nobody who could do the job required.
Now, let's look at one of Kinnock's biggest fights. Rooting out militant tendency, a radical left faction that had begun to take root during Foot's years.
You have to remember that he was fighting on many fronts. He had to deal with the entryism of militant tendency, which was a terrible threat. He had internal opposition from the Bennite left, what he calls the impossibilist left, and the sceptical right. You have to remember that 2/3 of his shadow cabinet had voted for Roy Hattersley, not for him.
Kinnock viewed these entryist factions as incredibly damaging and emblematic of the forces that prevented the Labour Party from evolving.
People who prize power in the Labour movement, the Labour Party, more than power for the Labour Party. And the reason is, at least those who cling to that and who are coherent about it, that if Labour has the right leadership, that is to say, one that conforms with their nostrum of democratic socialism, then the day will come when the general public is so repulsed by Tory exploitation, dishonesty, inconsistency, that there will be a kind of civil revolt, and the search will be on for a Labour Party that has been true to fundamental belief. And, I mean, it's deluded, but in pursuit of that, people spend a huge amount of time and effort on organising in groups of various kinds.
Kinnock encountered militant tendency when he was involved in local politics in Wales, and then again at university.
I then go to university and start encountering one or two people who were seriously engaged in the Socialist Labour League and various kinds of fringe front organisations. And our arguments got hotter and hotter. I mean, it was gobbledygook, really, but they did actually talk about permanent revolution and the fact that the needs and demands of the working class couldn't be met by bourgeois institutions. And I just thought this was weird. So I realized that these people had to be kept out of office. And so we tussled over who was going to be the minute secretary. I mean, that's what you call grassroots politics.
Members of militant tendency attempted to gain key positions in an effort to promote its policies, including widespread nationalisation and a large programme of public infrastructure investment. In Liverpool, the local party, which was dominated by militant members, took control of the city council in 1983. By September 1985, the council was going bankrupt and redundancy notices were sent to all staff. This gave Kinnock the opportunity to say what he'd wanted to say for a long time and address militant tendency head-on in his 1985 conference speech. He famously said, "I'm telling you, no matter how entertaining, how fulfilling to short-term egos, you can't play politics with people's jobs and with people's services." Here's Charles Clarke.
Decided to essentially say that at the Trade Union Congress, which had taken place 3 weeks earlier in Blackpool. He talked to John Hamilton, who was the leader of Liverpool City Council, a very nice man, but in the hands of the militant tendency there. And I remember on the train coming back, him saying, "You can't play politics with people's jobs," just as a comment. And he worked it up into his argument at the conference, and it turned out to be a politically electrifying moment and united what lots of people thought but didn't say. And Neil's courage was to say what was necessary to be said and to say it directly and not to pussyfoot around the discussion. And that was shocking to many people, most of all to Eric Heffer, a Liverpool MP, who walked off the stage.
My task in dealing with militant wasn't simply to denounce them, which I knew I had to do, but I had to delay for a whole damn year because of the miners' strike. If I'd tried to do it in the middle of the miners' strike, nobody would have been listening.
He spent a lot of time rooting out the members and removing them from the party.
The real challenge was gathering the evidence and staying within the rules of natural justice in order to prove conclusively and fairly that they were an organization. We had to demonstrate that they were organizing within that organization for political objectives in order to really demonstrate without any shadow of doubt that they were breaking the rules. So it took us about 8 months to do that and took up hours and hours and hours. It just went on and on and on, but we got rid of them.
I've looked up a footnote in the biography. It was a chapter precisely about militant tendency. He wrote, "Sorry this has taken so long. My fault. Reading it just depressed me almost to vanishing point. Christ, what a way to spend my 40s."
His initial speech at the party conference in 1983 when he was elected Labour leader, he said at the end of it, "Never, never again." What he meant was never Labour defeat again. And his driving force was to ensure that you did make the changes in Labour that would allow us to win. Now, he would never be concerned about people who thought there were different changes we should make, but he was concerned about that body of opinion which said just look backwards, don't look forwards. And he thought they had to be marginalised and isolated. Or those people who looked only at the interest of some parts of the population and not at the overall population as a whole. And he did get very impassioned about that, very cross about that. I would say completely rightly so, because he was impatient with the view we should be about anything other than winning the next general election.
Labour's 87 election material made much of his attack on militant tendency, trying to show the public that Labour was changing. Tony Benn, obviously also on the radical left, recorded in his diary, "The high peak of his strength is that he attacked the militant tendency. It made my blood run cold." Let's hear from Christopher Massey about the legacy of this period.
The legacy of it is basically that interest groups should not be allowed in the Labour Party and, largely speaking, are stopped from participating in the Labour Party. So the idea that a party within a party, a group with its own constitution, values and aims cannot be a part of the Labour Party, I think exists even today.
After returning to Parliament in a by-election 4 years earlier, in 1988, Tony Benn challenged Kinnock for the leadership, in a disruptive move similar to the one that he'd made in 1981 when he challenged Dennis Healey for the deputy leadership. Kinnock won by 89%. Here's Martin Westlake.
He had to see off the left again because he got a challenge to his leadership from Tony Benn and Eric Heffer, and John Prescott challenged Roy Hattersley for the deputy leadership. So that was 1988. So that had to be seen off.
More widely, Kinnock embarked on a widespread policy review, which transformed Labour's economic, industrial, welfare and foreign policies for the 1992 election. Let's hear from Charles Clarke and Martin Westlake on what this involved.
And so Neil had to go through a process of saying in each area, whether it was international policy, whether it was the utilities and how we ran them, our economic policy, council house ownership, a whole string of issues, as to say, was our policy actually the one that was fitted to the challenges of the future, or was it based on ideological preoccupations of the past? And in each of those, there was a massive discussion, a massive debate around them. Some involved some of our members' interests very directly. So, for example, trade union rights was another of that list of issues. That was far and away the biggest set of challenges he faced.
He managed to launch a policy reform process which resulted in 1989 in a document called Meet the Challenge, Make the Change, which was a sort of a precursor of what would become the manifesto ultimately in 1992. So it was pro-market economy, It proposed a new industrial relations law. Nationalisation would be very limited, it would be conditional. There was much more emphasis on education and the environment, and significantly, it was pro-EC. Meet the challenge, make the change. Large quantity of, how can I put it, fresh policy stances and attractive policy stances.
One of the policies he wanted to change was the policy of getting out of the European Union, which we'd run the 1983 election on the basis of going for. And he thought that was quite wrong. We needed to be part of the European Union. And he, in fact, published it as part of his manifesto for leadership of the Labour Party in September 1983, that approach to joining the European Union. But then the policies emerged all the way through that period. But the barriers were blocks of people who thought for various reasons that policy should not be changed. And that could only be dealt with by having a very substantial process of consideration. So policy review process was established, commissions were established to go through, take full account of the different policy orientations and to come up with a set of policy proposals that we thought would work for the modern era.
These policy changes made a Labour election win seem much more likely. Peter Dorey discusses how the Thatcher government responded internally.
I'm not sure she ever felt threatened by Labour. I think she was either confident enough or arrogant enough to think she would always beat Labour. But certainly a lot of Conservative MPs by 1989, 1990 were becoming worried now that Labour might become more electable. They began to modernise some of their policies. They began to sort of say, well, OK, maybe some of Thatcher's policies on privatisation and trade union reform, we're going to keep those policies, some of them. And therefore, Labour didn't appear by 1990 to be as dangerously left-wing as it had done in 83. So Labour became more popular in the opinion polls, and that began to cause alarm amongst some Conservative MPs.
Kinnock also modernised the internal workings of the party, especially with media management. Here's Charles Clarke and David Kogan.
There was then a set of organisational questions about how we selected our parliamentary candidates, how we got, for example, more women into parliamentary candidate positions, a whole series of issues which had to be addressed.
Shadow Communications Agency was run essentially by Philip Gold and Deborah Mattinson. Manson brought them in. There's, again, a hilarious story of Tony Benn and his diaries going to a NEC meeting with the Shadow Communications Agency representing their sort of Deborah Mattinson view of the electorate, and Ben just absolutely appalled by how they appeared to try to be appealing to readers of the Daily Mail and how this was nothing to do with him. And you really had the culture clash. Well, those people were all instrumental in changing the tone and culture and nature of the party. And, of course, they all then bleed into the new Labour era as well.
The policy issues in particular raised great sharpness. That was also true of the brand, which was the Red Rose, and because it was thought by some to be betraying the socialist heritage of the Labour Party. I never thought that was true. In fact, the Red Rose was the symbol of European social democracy, and we thought that was the right symbol to send, an internationalist outward-looking approach, that we thought the Red Rose did better than the red flag.
One of the policies that Kinnock saw as being key to change was the policy of commitment to unilateral nuclear disarmament. Kinnock himself was tied to this agenda, having been really active in CND, and it had been Labour Party policy in the 1983 manifesto, which had mentioned nuclear weapons 36 times.
Kinnock, of course, had been a member of CND and was a unilateralist. This was one of the great dividing lines in the Labour Party in the 60s and 70s. Every time there was a debate about anything to do with armed services, armed forces, Margaret Thatcher would attack Neil Kinnock as being a man who basically was prepared to give up Britain's nuclear deterrent.
In 1989, Kinnock addressed the NEC. Many in this room have protested and marched in support of nuclear disarmament. I have done something else. I have gone to the White House, the Kremlin, and the Elysee, and argued down the line for unilateral nuclear disarmament. I knew they would disagree with the policy, but above that they were totally uncomprehending that we should want to get rid of a nuclear missile system without getting the elimination of nuclear weapons on other sides. Ben recorded in his diary, The right clapped, and that was the first and only applause of the whole 2 days. I suppose I ought to put my reflections down. It was a remarkable 2 days. The NEC has abandoned socialist aspirations and any idea of transforming society. It has accepted the main principles not only of capitalism but of Thatcherism. Kinnock won the key vote to change the policy, and in the 1992 manifesto, nuclear weapons weren't mentioned at all. Now, let's hear from David Kogan and Martin Westlake on Kinnock's leadership qualities.
You have this kind of wide range of talent that's coming into the parliamentary party, who will actually become the backbone of the 97 government. Blair, Brown, Cook, Jack Straw.
Blair and Gordon Brown were both Neil Kinnock protégés. They were both championed by him. His managerial skills, which are second to none, and his pragmatism, those are his great strengths.
He stood up in 83 when he became leader. He stood up between 83 and 86, facing challenges that most Labour leaders have never had to challenge, and then he rebuilt the party. So I think Neil Kinnock's leadership qualities are of an absolute nature.
And where was he less strong?
I think he took too much on himself at times. I think he felt that he had to, because one of those values that he learned from his parents was a sense of duty. And so his sense of duty told him that he had to take on things where a greater delegator might have done things in a different way. But Neil felt that that was the only way that he could be certain that they would be done in the way that he wanted them to be done.
Much of the media were very critical of Kinnock. And as I said last week, this period was when the importance of the media's negative impact on Labour leaders stepped up. Newspapers still had a monopoly of opinion journalism. In 1992, the conservative-leaning Daily Mail, The Express and The Sun had a combined circulation of 7 million, while the only left-wing tabloid, the Daily Mirror, had 3 million.
The effect of the press, the media, cannot be measured or regarded to be significant in the short term. So nasty front pages on election day make no difference whatsoever. There's a saying in Welsh, Davel donc garreg, dripping breaks the stone. And that dripping in cartoons, opinion columns, more than editorials, headlines, the use of antagonistic adjectives in otherwise straightforward news reports, the misreporting of news. That's much more damaging.
Although broadcast media was still required to remain impartial, Kinnock recognised that newspapers often shape the stories and therefore the news agenda, making true impartiality harder to maintain.
Inevitably, unavoidably, the broadcast media, even the large parts of it that strive for dispassion and objectivity and truth, must to an extent be echo chambers of the predominant print media. The balance of attitudes expressed by the print media are reflected to an extent that is difficult to measure, but exists in the broadcast media. And if you're on the side that is under attack, that's unfortunate. And I've always been on the side that's under attack. And you mustn't bend to it, because that gives them even more confidence of victory.
They had this image in mind of the caricature. Of course, if you are talking to the electorate and the electorate is being given that image, then of course it harms your ability to convince voters.
The modernisation that Kinnock had undertaken had boosted Labour's polling, and a victory in the next election seemed possible, especially as Thatcher was becoming more and more unpopular.
Margaret Thatcher, who was becoming regarded as being increasingly shrill, and had become almost manically attached to the poll tax at the time, which a lot of her colleagues in the Conservative Party realised was going to be a vote loser. If there had been a general election in 1990, polls showed that Labour would have won it. with Neil Kinnock as leader. So we have to bear that in mind when we talk about 1992, because it was still the same leader, but it was a lost general election.
Thatcher resigned as Conservative Party leader in 1990, and John Major took over.
On the night that Margaret Thatcher resigned, I got my office staff in, which is only about, I think, 14 people, and a couple of other people from the shadow cabinet, and chums in the PLP, and I said, come in and have a drink. And I said, now, be merry tonight, because tomorrow we've got an entirely different battle on our hands. Our greatest electoral asset has just walked through the door. It became very, very clear very quickly that, not just from the opinion polls, which rapidly shifted, the feeling very rapidly took root that the change that people had wanted had actually come. And that by the election, they could safely continue to vote Conservative, because it was all right now with John Major, who, apart from nothing else, had got rid of the poll tax. And so we were beaten.
Labour are trying to build to this crescendo. They're trying to build to this point where the election's going to take place. It doesn't quite come off at the 92 election.
John Major called the election for April 1992. Most pollsters predicted that Labour would win narrowly, but they lost, and Major's Conservatives won a majority of 21, with the most number of votes any party had ever won in a general election, over 14 million. It led to an inquiry into the methodology of opinion polls, and was a truly shocking and devastating loss for the Labour Party. Here's David Kogan.
In various ways, she was becoming a liability.
I mean, the Murdoch press, actually the right-wing press, but certainly the Murdoch press, absolutely thought Kinnock was vulnerable, and they went after him. They didn't particularly like John Major, but John Major was Thatcher's heir, and they weren't going to back away from that.
Even John Major has since described the campaign against Kinnock as crude and over the top. On the day of the election, the Sun's front page famously declared, "If Kinnock wins today, will the last person to leave Britain please turn out the lights?" Followed by the next day's headline after the Conservatives were victorious. "It's the Sun what won it."
I think you could argue that in 92, the press had a bigger impact than almost any election we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years. And of course, it also meant that by the time New Labour came in, Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell and the others were absolutely not going to allow the Tory press to do that, which is why they would work so hard on getting Murdoch on side.
It was bitterly disappointing for Labour's top team.
I wasn't surprised by the result. I'd hoped that we might get a position where the Tories didn't get an overall majority, and I suppose in my heart of hearts I expected that. I never expected that we would get an overall majority, but I thought we would take the overall majority away from the Tories. At the end of the day, that only became clear as about a dozen seats went just the wrong way in the early night of the Friday after the election. That was very disappointing. I was very disappointed at that, but I hadn't expected an overall majority. I had thought we might win through the Tories not having an overall majority.
As the election went on, I realised that we hadn't shifted the centre of gravity enough, and that this feeling that John Major was enough of a change was something that people would settle for.
There were two key moments in the campaign that contributed to the defeat. The first was the shadow budget from Shadow Chancellor John Smith, which proposed raising the top rate of tax from 40 to 50%. Labour claimed that 8 out of 10 voters would benefit, but it backfired, giving the Conservatives a chance to push a Labour tax bombshell message, undermining the years of work that Labour had put into rebuilding trust on the economy. The other moment was the Sheffield rally near the end of the campaign. Kinnock had shouted to the crowd of 10,000 members, "We're all right, we're all right." The event made the party look overconfident and triumphalist.
In addition, Thatcher started making the charge. John Major reinforced it, that whilst we should be praised for the changes we'd made, that praise had to be qualified on two grounds. One, we'd only learned the error of our ways and were emulating what Mrs. Thatcher had left. which was not true, but nevertheless, it had resonance. And the other thing that had resonance was the idea that the changes we'd made were opportunistic, superficial, and they would not be followed through long term, which is also absolute nonsense, as Tony Blair later proved by effectively implementing just about all the policies that we'd compiled in my years as leader.
Only two members of the 1979 government who were still in the shadow cabinet were Roy Hattersley and John Smith. Everybody else had come through, and Brown, Blair, all of them by 92 have come through, and he's revolutionised the PLP front bench. He's taken control of the organs of the party. He's changed his own self-image. And Kinnock went from being a politician of the 1960s and early 70s to being a politician of the modern age. So he did all the right things, Neil Kinnock, except win.
So why did Labour lose? The reasons are complicated. Here's Neil Kinnock.
The trouble was, and I say this with maximum passion, I was there too damn long, which is in the end, I think, was a major contributory factor to beating us. But the fact that I'd been there for 9 years, if you're Prime Minister for part of that time, okay, the picture changes. But to be slogging away as the nagging voice of negativism and attack, even when we got rid of Maggie Thatcher, along came the nice, and he is nice, fresh, and he was fresh, normal, and he is normal, John Major. So here was this stale guy parading around, trying to be the next Prime Minister, and it didn't work.
David Kogan blames the shadow budget and also the fact that John Major turned out to be a much stronger campaigner than Labour were expecting.
He lost the general election in 92 because John Smith walked into the Tory trap over tax cuts, of making Labour appear to be, as usual, the tax and spend party. And John Major, who turned out to be a much better campaigner, I think they probably also underestimated John Major quite significantly as a political campaigner. I mean, that soapbox thing in 92, I remember I covered that election, and, you know, you could tell people thought John Major was a sort of good guy who was competent.
Kinnock still has old Labour in his rear view, even though he's done everything he can to try and move Labour away from that. The Conservatives attacks the media, and indeed kind of, I think, just the general psyche of the British public. It's the same Labour Party that brought us the winter of discontent, brought us strikes, brought us economic turmoil, and was very left-wing when it tried to reinvent itself. And this is the challenge for all Labour leaders at times, I think.
Labour apparently did some internal polling after the 92 election defeat and said to voters, look, why did you not vote for Labour? What did we do wrong? You know, we've tried to modernise, we've had a policy review, we've toned down our radicalism, and you still didn't vote for us. What was the problem? And Labour found out that even apart from any problems with Neil Kinnock, that voters in 92 didn't trust Labour on the economy. They didn't like Labour's close links to the trade unions. And there were also some indications, and I find this quite sad personally, but there are some indications that people sort of say, oh, basically, we see Labour as the party of society's minorities and losers. Yeah, the party of the unemployed, the party of feminists. What are you going to do for us? And so Labour had a problem, therefore, as it were, in conveying to mainstream Middle England, as it became known, what it would do for them. So it wasn't just about, as it were, kind of make John Major being more attractive to voters or more prime ministerial than Neil Kinnock. It was also Labour itself had, as it were, a kind of image problem or reputation problem amongst many voters.
Kinnock resigned, saying in his speech, "My sorrow is that millions, particularly those who do not have the strength to defend themselves, will suffer because of the election of another Conservative government."
His resignation speech at the end of the general election in 1992 could not but remember how moving it was. I mean, it was devastating for him personally, given all of the effort that we've been talking about that he had put into trying to shift his party into government.
Finally, let's look at Kinnock's legacy. Most positively, he set the foundations for Labour's landslide in 1997, having modernised the party, improved its media image and tackled internal divisions. But obviously those on the left of the party blamed Kinnock for what they saw as an acceptance of the Thatcherite agenda. Let's hear from our guests.
Neil Kinnock's greatest achievement as being Labour leader is modernising the party to get it onto a footing where it was electable.
So I think Neil Kinnock cleared away a vast amount of undergrowth, allowing a clear road for whoever the next Labour leader was going to be, aided by the Conservatives in 5 years in power being fairly disastrous in any number of different ways. But Neil Kinnock actually was a fundamental part of Labour's win.
A visionary leader of tremendous, compelling passion and power, and an ability to unite people behind him. And those were tremendous leads. And his actual performance as a Labour Party leader in 2 general elections was better, both in terms of votes and in terms of seats and in terms of percentage of the vote, than many Labour leaders, but unfortunately never making it to power.
This idea that you could just wait for the electoral pendulum to swing back, you'll never believe that. He believed that you had to make changes, that you had to make yourself attractive, that you had to make yourself convincing, that you had to make yourself credible, plausible to the electorate. And you had to do that taking into account the people, not in a populist way, but understanding that there has been social evolution and economic evolution, that the electorate is changing, and that if you stand still, then you will find yourself leaving your electorate behind.
Let's hear from Neil himself. He starts by speaking about Blair.
And the fact that I, in his words, enabled them to have a winning party is, I guess, the legacy. Because I think that self-criticism is healthy. I've still got room for criticizing myself, that I didn't really ram home understanding of the fact that the struggle for power in a democracy is perpetual. You can never take your foot off, and you've got to keep on pushing for it, which means that you've got to keep on changing, renovating, looking forward, modernizing. You can never rest on that, because people live different lives from week to week, have different expectations, aspirations, concepts of rights. And a progressive political party, certainly a socialist one, has got to stay ahead of that.
Neil Kinnock was a man who deserved to win. And what he ended up being was the man who prepared Labour to win.
Thanks so much for listening to this Leading Labour episode on Neil Kinnock. Thanks especially to Neil Kinnock for providing such thoughtful insights. It's amazing to actually hear from the leader themselves about what it's like to lead the Labour Party after all the discussions that we've heard over the last episodes. We also heard from Charles Clarke, Martin Westlake, David Kogan, Christopher Massey and Peter Dorey. The links to read more about them, as well as links to buy any of their brilliant books, are in the description of this episode. Next week, we'll look at Kinnock's successor, John Smith. Please subscribe so you don't miss out. This episode was researched, presented and produced by me, Izzy Conn. Special thanks goes to Will Barber-Taylor for editing and additional research. The artwork for this episode is by Sydney Godden. Music is by Rickard Fromm.